Hello everyone, and welcome to the first webinar in our new Access Granted webinar series, a 5-part security and authentication online event series focused on helping enterprises face the ever-shifting and evolving security threat. My name is Ryan Schraden. I'm the executive editor of the Access Granted online publication. I'll be moderating our discussion today, which will feature 2 very exciting guests, Jeff Schmidt and Doug Howard. Jeff and Doug are both CEOs of their organizations. Jeff is the CEO of Automate, a provider of credential orchestration and authentication solutions, and Doug is the CEO of Savanture, a MSSP and security consulting firm focused on reducing their customers' risk profile. They're here today for a very interesting discussion, analyzing some of the most well-known recent security breaches. Gentlemen, thanks for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. Looking forward to it.
And it's a pleasure to have both of you weighing in on such an interesting topic. So for our listeners, we'll be doing a brief Q&A session at the end. I encourage you all to submit questions to me, your moderator, as they enter your mind. Just use the chat functionality on your bar there and just direct questions to me. And then at the end, if there's some time, I'll go through and ask 1 or 2 to our panelists at the end of the discussion. So let's jump in with the meat of the discussion here and look at the first security breach on the autopsy table, and that's the breach that impacted one of the nation's largest health insurers, Anthem. So Jeff, can you tell us exactly what was breached and how this breach occurred? Can you also discuss the impact that this breach had on the company, its business, and its customers?
Yeah, sure, Ryan. So based on the information that's available and we were able to pull, the total compromise is somewhere around 80 million records that were taken from Anthem. Looking into it and kind of diving a little bit further is, it looks like the attackers were able to get in leveraging administration privileges that they were able to get by getting credentials of at least 5 of the employees that had high-level IT access or access to the system admin pieces of the network. How they got those is not known. There's a lot of different ways that hackers go about getting that type of information. And then once they had that, they then implemented what we kind of call as a backdoor to be able to start to pull out information from the database and pull out information that was critical to, or critical information or PII information that came out of the system at that point. You know, this is kind of a common theme that we see, which is you get credentials that are exposed. Once those are exposed, the bad guys have access to a lot of information. Then it happens over time of taking away critical information. One of the comments at the end of it was, you know, reliance on technology. In this case, is it appears, at least in the reports that came out as well, is that it was a human that happened to catch the act, which is a good thing. That means that at least there was somebody who was paying attention and looking at information other than just relying on technology that caught the information and at least could squelch what was happening in the background. When you look at it, I mean, obviously there's a lot of impacts that come out of the back end of this, which is, you know, first of all the work that goes into HIPAA and PII, the information that, you know, all of us as individuals, every time we visit a doctor's office, health organization, it's pushed into us about privacy and privacy of information and who it goes to. That obviously has a sense of impact of we're putting so much emphasis on letting people know about it, and then we have a breach that allows PII information to get out. On top of that, it's the cost of the company of having to provide the insurance or the backup in, you know, credit, fraud monitoring, et cetera. And even further, then you can take it a step further, is there's a lot of things in there like social security numbers that when taken, if it's somebody who doesn't have credit today or maybe isn't aware, those are high value items of somebody who is under 16, that those social security numbers are brand new, usable, and can be leveraged and for years before somebody might know that they've actually had a social security number used in a fraudulent activity. So, you know, I think it's the optics, clearly around PII and HIPAA. It's the optics around what we expect our healthcare and frankly any businesses to provide a certain amount of security of how they handle your information. And then it's just the loss of dollars that now have to go into something to protect against potential leaks and potential issues. I think one of the things was, you know, 1 in 3 people who receive a notification in the mail will become the victim of fraud. I have at least 5 of those this year now that have come to me via different breaches that have happened. So our numbers are escalating based on the breaches that have happened in the industry to this point.
That's a pretty frightening metric. So, Doug, we heard Jeff talk a little bit about how this occurred and what the impact has been on Anthem. What could Anthem have done differently to mitigate the damage from this breach? And could it have been avoided altogether, or not? Maybe just had the damage just kind of turned down a little bit. And what lessons should attendees learn from this breach?
Sure, and I'm going to mix a couple of those things in there too. Just to add to what Jeff said as well, I mean, if you look at organizations as a whole, a lot of times organizations generally treat all of their systems the same rather than understanding exactly what the classifications of those systems are, where the PII data is. And I'm sure Anthem's not one of those in this particular case, but if you look at, again, companies in general, a lot of times security is applied generically across most of the key systems, maybe at an admin level. So really understanding where your information is and where your critical information is certainly one key aspect of all of that. I mean, if you look specifically, as Jeff was alluding to, not only social security numbers, but email, physical address, date of birth, employment, including income and family information, were some of the elements that can be lost when an insurance company is breached. But to answer your questions a little bit more specifically, one of the key things that most organizations need to do, both at a log level from an administrator as well as from a multi-factor authentication, is really monitor the activities of individual admins. We all kind of get a little loose with the assumption that our admins aren't doing anything bad, which, again, internals, insider threats are one aspect, but sometimes monitoring the activities of employees, especially admins, is a critical step, not only because of insider threats, but more specifically because those credentials can be compromised. And these anomalous behaviors, in this particular breach appear, at least on all the public information, to have been going on for months. So this isn't something that, somebody got credentials, logged in, took advantage of the particular situation, and then ran. This seems to have gone on for multiple months prior to it being detected. The other things is, from a continuous monitoring perspective, which I alluded to, understanding the activity profiles of your employees as well as those administrators, and then user base too, because this is a bit of a whack-a-mole type of scenario where you've got to watch everybody that ever touches that data, and that's why, again, going back to the key point, understanding where that data resides, who has access to it, and also from a control perspective, making sure that you don't have individuals that shouldn't have access to data is certainly one of those key aspects. And some of this can be detected at a network level. Some of this can be detected only at a server level. Some of this needs to be detected in a combination of monitoring authentication logs on two-factor authentication, as well as on the servers themselves. But again, there's no doubt in this particular situation that multi-factor authentication was probably one of the root errors in the scheme that could have helped protect that.
Excellent. So what I've heard you both say, this was most likely due to a case of some compromised credentials that people were able to exploit, kind of build a backdoor, utilize over time until it was finally discovered by humans. And it sounds like as far as how we could mitigate this, we're looking at, monitoring our employees and their activities a little bit better, maybe having slightly better access control to control where they're going in the network and what information that they're seeing, and then also maybe some multi-factor authentication to make sure that compromised credentials like those don't lead to some bad behaviors and some data theft on the back end. So let's move on to another recent and very frightening breach, and I have a feeling that this is one of the ones that's pretty scary for everyone that's on the phone right now, because I have a feeling that everyone on the phone, all of our attendees, has at some point frequented this establishment. And let's talk about the Starbucks breach. So Doug, can you tell us about this breach, specifically what was impacted, how was it perpetrated, and what impact did it have on Starbucks, its customers, and the company's business?
Sure, and so, whenever you've got a large base of users, as we've always discussed, you've got to make ease of use, one of the key aspects here. But at the same time, as an owner of data and one that takes responsibility for that data, clearly you've got to be able to take some responsibility, and if that means, inconvenience internally as far as encryption and various other aspects, or to the user in some type of factored authentication, you need to make sure that you do that. But specific to the background, in May of 2015, it was clear that there was a larger than normal number of user accounts on the Starbucks app that were compromised. And specifically, what this allowed somebody to do, hackers to do, is to get into those accounts, withdraw the money through either fulfilling gift cards and mailing it to an anonymous address, or using those as an online currency. The second aspect of that, obviously, is that these were linked to credit cards. And this is an interesting phenomenon in the industry, because used to every transaction on a credit card, the user had to approve. But now, as we all have many reoccurring billing aspects that get billed to our credit card, if those credentials are compromised, it is possible, as seen in this particular case, where you can continue to recharge your credit and therefore withdraw that either from your associated banking account or credit card that is linked to it. So in essence, somebody can go break into your account and then steal hundreds of dollars, and typically that's kind of the range that were lost in this case. Now, one of the early aspects of this, and why some people believe that it was tied more to a Starbucks type of situation, is that as early as 2014, it was reported over and over again that Starbucks app was actually passing credentials in the clear. Now, Starbucks, as fair as you could say, has said this was not a compromise on their part. Nothing was broken into. None of their systems were hacked. Rather, that the compromise occurred in other systems that were outside of their control, other online applications that ultimately the users reused the same ID and password as they use for multiple online properties, and therefore were able to legitimately log in with the credentials of a valid user in the system.
You mentioned the auto reload, and to me, I think that was one of the things that was most frightening about this breach, was the fact that it wasn't just what was on these cards that these bad actors were able to get. If you had $50 on your Starbucks card, they could take that, but then the credit cards would automatically deduct another 50 or 100 or whatever you had it set up. And I believe at the end of the day, what I was hearing was hundreds of dollars worth of Starbucks credits were getting stolen in each of these situations from some of these accounts because of that tie, the auto reload to the credit card. So you most likely had some very caffeinated, twitchy hackers running around out there who had stolen hundreds of dollars in some cases from some of these people. So Jeff, what can companies learn from what happened to Starbucks here? What systems and processes should they have in place to help mitigate the impact of a breach like this?
So a couple of things, Brian. I was thinking about how much caffeine can you drink in one day, and there's probably a mathematical equation that would rule out how much money you can spend in a day on coffee. So the first piece, I think it goes back to the users, right? When we leverage or use an application and we tie our credit cards, PayPal accounts to it, whatever it may be, for auto reloads, we need to really think as individuals of what our responsibility is. And take the first one, which is, one of the studies said that the normal user has 100 or plus application websites that they go to, and they reuse their credentials, the typical 5 user credentials that they reuse over and over again. So that means that the ability to take advantage of somebody once a user ID or password is compromised becomes highly viable, that they can go in and start to take advantage of other accounts. And that gets into what we call security hygiene, of having different passwords and looking after things in such a way that you protect your critical data. So that's kind of the first piece, is we as individuals have a responsibility. The other piece is, you can look at things like two-factor authentication. You can look at additional challenges for behavior that is different, what we call anomaly detection, which Doug could attest to. Is there's certain behavior patterns that we're here that, as an organization, just like a credit card organization would do, is at some point becomes 5 reloads in the same day and you've never done that in your lifetime before, that should set off triggers within an environment that's monitoring the re-ups on the cards or on the apps. So I think that there's some opportunities there that on the Starbucks side, from a good stewards and custodians of the process to the people to building better framework, but we choose continuously convenience over security as individuals because we don't want to be hassled for the normal piece. And to a certain extent, you're forgiven for the bad behavior because somebody takes care of that fraudulent behavior for you. If that fraudulent behavior actually cost you $500 during that time period, you may start to address your passwords as if they were cash. And I think it's a behavioral change for the individuals. It's industry building in the right factors of authentication while keeping it convenient, but giving strong capabilities to the end user that allow them access and allow them a security and a sense of confidence that the transactions and their information is protected.
So to sum up, in the case of this Starbucks breach, this sounds like, at least according to Starbucks and what we're seeing, this was a situation where a couple of accounts, or actually a larger than normal amount of accounts, may have been hacked individually, most likely due to people's credentials getting compromised somewhere else outside of Starbucks' application. But, that doesn't necessarily mean that Starbucks is completely off the hook. This isn't all individuals and cyber hygiene and making sure you're not reusing passwords and using strong passwords. There are some things that Starbucks could have done to help mitigate this. So, whether it be some kind of anomaly detection that would have identified them that these cards were getting recharged, outside of the normal behavior, maybe some multi-factor authentication so that, a compromised set of credentials somewhere else wouldn't necessarily mean people could get right into these accounts. There were some things that Starbucks as a company could have done to maybe mitigate this a little bit. Sorry, go ahead.
Doug, and I was just going to add to that. And, in all fairness, too, all things security don't always happen within IT security at a network layer or a server level. In this particular case, some of the fraud things that we're talking about clearly need to happen within the application itself, actually looking at the transactions, not necessarily user activities at a network or a login level. So again, just a point of clarity.
Excellent. So let's move on. We have a few more breaches to focus on. So for the next one, let's focus on Dropbox. So Dropbox is a cloud storage solution that many people use for both their personal and professional files. Now, I know this is a breach that impacted both individuals and enterprises, because a lot of enterprises might use the enterprise level of Dropbox to facilitate collaboration within the organization, the sharing of large files, etc. So, Jeff, how did the Dropbox breach occur? How did bad actors get access to their network, and what impact did it have on the company's business?
So Ryan, a good lead-in from the prior one, and I think is just when we look at this is we're talking a 7 million usernames, passwords from Dropbox that were taken. That's what Pastebin reported when they reported the event happening and what had happened. From Dropbox's perspective, they said it was not a breach on their side. They said that it was due to stolen credentials, unrelated services, and the attackers used these credentials to get into Dropbox. So you're kind of in that same discussion that we were just having is the protection pieces. And as a result, that's where Dropbox went into the two-factor authentication and asking users to take the extra step to try and mitigate these things because we do have bad hygiene and we do have the reuse. And I would add to it is it's not only the authentication piece, but it's the authenticity of the transaction going forward. So, their comments coming back is, there's the right measures in place to detect the suspicious login activities going forward. But in this case is you had a number of user IDs, passwords, and information that was leveraged, taken, and created a huge amount of issues from an optics perspective, business perspective, and personal perspective of accounts are exposed. Everybody had to go in and rechange passwords. So the level of trust level and in something already that has a lot of curiosity and suspicion is cloud storage. It just adds to that, what I'll call is people kind of lagging behind and not trusting what's out there.
Excellent. So Doug, Dropbox maintains that it wasn't breached. Like Jeff just said, these were compromised credentials that came in from somewhere else, and people were reusing passwords and able to get, access to some Dropbox accounts. I mean, is that accurate? Is that the perception of people out there, that this wasn't necessarily Dropbox's fault? And if so, I mean, if that's the perception, has the company really experienced any negative effects from the breach?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple parts of that. So first of all, I think in general, just much like Starbucks, typically when people access user accounts and have complete access and are compromised, you see very, very large numbers. And while, yes, it was pretty clear that through a combination of many, many people, that there was definitely some level of compromise, saying that those compromises was associated with the hygiene of a potentially different site with username and reuse of the password certainly is a very defensible model given kind of the relatively small number of people that reported problems. However, in the scheme of things, you've heard this a couple times now, there's no doubt that all of us, and I'll admit, that from time to time I've certainly reused, a username or a password, and half the websites reuse my email as my username anyhow. So half of the people out there, or half of the hackers out there, already have 50% of your credentials in a scenario where you're using a static username and password. The second thing is, what are the alternatives? And so, one of those alternatives is obviously supposedly storing all your usernames and passwords in a file on your mobile device, for example, that is secure. And most of those applications that have been around for many years, in fact, are, unfortunately, probably aren't all that secure. And again, without going into specifics, certainly any time that you only have a static username and password, regardless of reuse, which is bad, as we clearly identified here, or if you're storing that in a common place, it creates risk. And so, from a capabilities perspective, as you saw the results of this, as many of these, on-site, on-web properties that retain your user information are moving to a multi-factor authentication type of solution. I have, a few bank accounts, and about 50% of my banks use multi-factor authentication, and the other 50% don't, and using static username and password, in essence, to my livelihood on a daily basis. So there's no doubt that in this particular case, it probably was not a compromise within Dropbox itself, but rather reuse of credentials that were stolen from a different property. The key question here, which you never hear in any of these, is, okay, where were they stolen from? Because now, if they're compromised, it's very likely that users have 15, 20 different sites that are compromised as well, that they should be focused on and worried about as well. And some of that responsibility still falls back to those online providers as well. If they know their account was compromised, even if it was through a different property, then there needs to be some responsibility for educating users and helping them understand that potentially those credentials were compromised at other sites as well.
That's definitely an interesting interesting point there. If I knew which account was breached, if someone had come out and said, hey, this potentially was breached, I know where I used that password and that username, correct? Like I could go in and maybe change things in other places before it becomes a snowball rolling down the hill and multiple of my accounts get compromised. That's a very interesting point. So let's move on to our next breach, and this is kind of a frightening one since there's probably quite a few attendees on this call who use this financial institution since it is one of the largest in the world. So let's talk about the recent hack of JPMorgan Chase. So Doug, let's go back to you again. How did this really, really large financial institution get breached? What was compromised, and how could a breach like this impact the company's business?
Well, so I mean, let's talk about how it impacts company businesses first, because we really haven't talked about that a whole lot in the scheme of things. So anytime you lose the credentials of any user out there, and it is tied back to you versus, I didn't do it or it got compromised somewhere else, but explicitly, no doubt about it, was tied back to you. In those particular cases, there is no doubt that as a primary holder of, again, many people's financial capabilities in this world, ultimately there's going to be a loss of trust with any vendor. And so ultimately, not only is there the immediate loss of trust, but it is going to impact and does impact, as proven many times over in reports, that users then often move accounts, do not do incrementally new business with a business, and so forth. Now, sometimes, maybe like in a Starbucks, for example, and those compromises, maybe they quit using their accounts online or in the app, for example. But I think the number with a lot of the online retailers, and Starbucks, I think, is the one I'll quote, with about 20% of their revenue is originated from that app. And so now, if you look at a large bank and financial institute like a JPMorgan, so what impact will that have if no longer users do online with them using username, password, and so forth? Are they going to open a new 401k somewhere? Are they going to transfer a 401k to a different account? All those types of things obviously trickle down. They also, in some cases, will result in lots of incremental expenses beyond just the breach itself. Breach costs anywhere from $1.25 to $3 per user just to be able to do notifications and ultimately the follow-up to that. And so you can imagine with this number of accounts, 83 million, so that's a huge number to any organization, no matter how big, no matter how big the revenue, no matter how big the profits are. That's a huge impact. Specifically to how it occurred, what appears here is, once again, a lot of the right things were done. For example, JPMorgan Chase, no doubt, has a tremendous, large security budget. They spend lots of money protecting the organization. However, in the scheme of all of that, and even using multi-factor authentication, the one key thing that was missed was a single server that ultimately resulted in the compromise. And so if you look at that, there's obviously the necessity of not only making sure that you're doing the right things and spending the right amount of money and having the right people there, but to go back and recheck all your stuff as well. And from an optics perspective, obviously that's a big negative for any organization. I think the one thing that I think a lot of people believe is that these things are now happening so often that people have become numb to them. And if you actually look at a lot of the follow-through numbers, Target being one, JPMorgan Chase, and some of those, you will absolutely hear in the reports that these types of events had significant negative impacts on them, not just the cost of the individual breach, but the follow-through for many years afterwards relative to trust and brand and incremental business and so forth and so on.
And I appreciate you taking extra time to kind of talk through, the repercussions of this, because I agree we haven't really taken a really deep dive into that in some of these other breaches that we've analyzed. But and I almost think this is a good one to do so. Because you think about Starbucks, your information gets stolen, or you lose some of your money on your gift card. Maybe you just stop using the gift card. Maybe you start paying cash, but chances are you're probably still going to Starbucks. In this situation, a large financial institution like this loses your information like this. There is a loss of trust, a breach of trust here. And I think you're spot on that people, if they're deciding where to open a 401k or where to get a loan, or even determining where they're going to keep their accounts moving forward, I think when it comes to banks and financial institutions specifically, trust is really all there is at the end of the day. Will you protect my money? And I think something like this could definitely have a huge impact on their business. So that being said, Jeff, Doug touched on it a little bit, talking about this single server that was kind of left, open. But what did they ultimately do wrong? What should they have done differently? And what lessons should they and our attendees who are joining us today learn from that?
So I think it's kind of hard to say what they did wrong. It's easy on the back end to kind of point fingers and look at it. So I'll start with a couple of things that I think you need to take into consideration. First is, organizations like JPMorgan acquire organizations all over the place. So where that server was, when it was acquired, et cetera, there's a lot of things that kind of go into play. When I look at this, I think gosh, that's a lot of records, and it's over a period of time that it's happening. And so that's where I kind of single in on a couple of things. So obviously, ensuring that they do have the two-factor authentication on across the board. There's probably a piece here to say is that, as Doug mentioned it earlier about how you share admin passwords, who they sit with, and where they go to. That obviously is an exploit that's been happening in many of the breaches that we've talked about and breaches that aren't on this list. So the other is not only trusting the tools that you use, and a lot of companies, when it comes down to looking at holes and flaws in the network and the servers, the routers, the switches, they're running a lot of the automated tools to do that. And while automated tools are good, they're not as good as somebody going through and looking at and specifically trying to target systems and applications. We'll call them the white hat hackers that are going through, and that's important to do in these organizations, especially when you are acquiring and bringing new things into the systems that you have. So the last piece would be is obviously I would look at it and say, there was an anomaly within the network happening while these records were being taken, and that in and of itself should have thrown out a bunch of alerts inside the system well before you hit the double digit in the millions of impacted as this was happening. So I think you have to go back and you have to reset. You can't stop a network from being breached. I think there's always going to be open holes. There's always the Trojan horse from the inside. What you have to do is be prepared to catch it quickly, to be able to shut it down and be able to know how to react to it quickly. And that's really the bigger goal. You can't assume that you're not breachable. You have to assume you are and be somewhat in paranoia mode all the time. So to simplify it, lock down your credentials, implement a way of implementing the two-factor solutions, make sure that you're doing the right outside testing, not only depending on tools, and that you have manual and automation processes to minimize and mitigate the breach when it does happen.
Yeah, and this is Doug. I'm going to add two more things to that very quickly. So as a managed security service provider, we see lots of these types of scenarios, and I don't know if this is an exact fact, but I would argue that to a very large degree, and don't forget that JPMorgan Chase was using the two-factor authentication pretty regularly across all their environment. So one of the key things we always do when we're monitoring, and anybody can do this, you can do this with a log management system, you can do this with your SIEM, you can do this with lots of different tools, but ultimately don't assume that whatever technologies you've implemented from a security perspective are always working properly. First of all, vendor products can fail, although the mass majority of these failures is typically going to be misconfiguration by a user, and that includes not turning something on. So a very large portion of multi-factor authentication failures we ever see are simply because somebody forgot to turn them on or put a static username and ID in, or username and password in for a particular user account. And so one of the things we do, and highly recommend if you have this capability in your organization, is monitor both the source being the server that users are going to, and also your multi-factor authentication, and correlate against that. Because ultimately, if you don't see them hit your multi-factor authentication system, and you do see them log directly into a server, clearly your multi-factor authentication has failed. The second thing is, again, from an MSSP perspective, monitoring those capabilities from a bandwidth perspective. That Jeff and I have had the fortune of working together in the past as well, and both of us managed MSSPs. Monitoring for outgoing bandwidth is an easy thing to do. That's not to say that somebody can't slow roll pulling data out of a system and fall below your thresholds, but ultimately that suspicious activity, either because of the activity itself or because of things like the amount of bandwidth on a pair of IPs, can easily be detected in most anomaly detection systems. And then the last thing there, obviously, is the multi-factor authentication systems usually give you the capability of going in and actually showing you logs that have been applied against your environment. And so having somebody go through and audit those, either through automation or through manual, and confirming that all those systems are showing authentications against them is certainly one of the tactical aspects as well.
Excellent. I think it's all great advice. We're running a little long, so I want to get into our final breach that we're going to be talking about. And this is one of those last but not least, since this is something that's extremely recent and huge. This has been a breach that has not only impacted our national security, but the personally identifiable information of as many as 21 million federal employees, and that's the breach of the Office of Personnel Management, or OPM. For the folks on the phone that aren't familiar with what OPM does specifically, it's the agency that handles the federal government's human resources. It's also responsible for background checks. So, Doug, this is ultimately shaping up to be one of the largest breaches in recent history as far as the number of individuals impacted. So, what went wrong at OPM? How did this go down?
Well, again, let's provide a little bit of context here of why this is even important. A lot of people probably would look at this as, who cares if somebody knows that they applied for a security clearance? Well, certainly on a global basis, from a governmental perspective, there's obviously all types of red flags that go up there. Who has a top secret clearance? Who applied for a top secret clearance? Who didn't get a top secret clearance but maybe got a lesser, a particular approval? All of those things are very important, but personally, I'm a U.S. Air Force guy, so if you look at the clearance that I had during my time in, ultimately the amount of information that was collected on me is certainly a lot of information that I don't necessarily want out in the public. Again, it's a step above certainly those things, social security number and telephone number and stuff like that is certainly able to recreate identity, but with the information collected for background checks, it can be significantly more. And as you see in their disclosure, it's not just about the individuals that had background checks and security clearances. It was also those family members and those other people that they interviewed and so forth and so on. And that's how you ultimately got to the $21 million number. Now, there's still some fuzziness of exactly what happened here, but obviously, the DHS story is that ultimately the attackers gained valid user credentials from the system through social engineering. Now, I have done and do a lot of business with the government, and I can tell you of all the organizations in the world that use multi-factor authentication, the government is certainly one of those. So it seems a little uncertain, but once again, this could be another JPMorgan Chase scenario where ultimately lots of money being spent, lots of right things being done, but ultimately one vector was lost. Might be a single server, might be access to certain systems simply because you have lots of people accessing those systems. So maybe from a financial perspective, multi-factor authentication didn't seem practical from a financial perspective. But all those things have now changed in the industry. And I think that's one of the key takeaways here. Is used to, when you went out and you wanted to implement a multi-factor authentication strategy, those were so expensive that they were not able to be applied extremely broadly. And sometimes simply usability was also a challenge now. But as we all know, and certainly Ultimate knows and has provided, that has changed significantly. Cost factors are a fraction of what they used to be. Usability is much higher. And so my guess here is this was a lag of either one, certain elements were left unprotected by multi-factor authentication, or number two, there was a financial decision made at some point not to put multi-factor authentication on, but if that had been recently relooked at, most likely it would have been applied.
Excellent. So, Jeff, based on what Doug has said, based on what's been disclosed about the incident, what do you feel OPM could have done differently to help mitigate the impact of this?
So I'll go back to what Doug originally said at the beginning, which is, first is we're dealing with the government, and they've had a lot of rule sets over the last 10 years around data classification. This data obviously is classified and has a specific rating to it. Having this data encrypted and secured appropriately. That leads me to the second point, though, is as we understand it, it's actually stolen IDs, credentials again. So if you have the credentials, while encryption is good, you can still, if you got the capability and the access, then encryption is going to be defeated. So you have to look at it and say, it goes back to is where was the breach found in the credentials? Were they using 2FA? And they have to go back and look at the processes and the controls. And what I can read and what I've seen online, it's convenience over security again. And this is where we have to implement the right security hygiene. We need to secure the credentials in such a way that you can add authenticity along with the authentication. You can challenge a user when behavior looks odd or malicious, and that you can also have a risk-based process wrapped around it. Is there some intelligence to that authentication? And there is opportunity in the marketplace to do that. From my perspective, also just to kind of mention, this is the 5th this year in 2015 of a breach to the federal government. So U.S. Central Command was hacked on their social media accounts. The FAA had malware that impacted it. The Federal Reserve in St. Louis had malware on the website that impacted users coming in. The IRS had PII information of taxpayers. I think that was in the hundreds of thousands. So we also have, I think, antiquated systems working in the government and having experience. We have a lot of competing organizations and agencies that contain information and duplication of data. And I think that's where we need to really look at federal, state, city, municipalities and how they handle that data. And rather than replicating data, is starting to minimize the redundancy that's being built in or the replication that's being done with data. So, that information Doug talked about may not only exist in OPM, but it may also exist in a number of other places. So there's a lot of work to be done, and that requires the agencies to work together and to work differently than they're working today.
Excellent. So we've now laid out 5 separate recent security breaches that were very high profile, that have been covered very extensively in the media. We've looked at why they happened, the impact they had on the organizations, what they could have done differently. So I'd like to give you both an opportunity to weigh in. What are the trends or key takeaways do you both see across all of these breaches that our listeners can learn from? Doug, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think the key aspect here is a couple things. So number one is, first and foremost, if you read any report and you read through any, of these compromises, understand, as part of your job as a security expert or as part of your team that are security experts, they need to keep track of what is happening in the marketplace, where compromises are coming from, and so forth, and think about how those would be fixed on a regular basis, and make sure that obviously they're applying those to their environment. The second thing is clearly, if you read research and relative to polls and analysis, multi-factor authentication will certainly solve many of those problems that occurred in the marketplace. In fact, I think of all the ones we've discussed, at the core of this, probably multi-factor authentication would have helped prevent most of this. Again, if you forget to put multi-factor authentication on a server, then obviously you still got a problem, and that's where some of those best practices come in. And that is, never assume that any one element of security is going to operate perfectly and always monitor for the fact that it could fail. Whether you've got multi-factor authentication, where you've got static username and password, whether you've got traffic controls in place, whatever that may be. And I think one thing to remember too is this problem is only going to get bigger and bigger. So if you look at just now, I happen to be in our security operations center, and I see CNN up, and it's basically saying Chrysler cars can be remotely hacked. So we're on the phone right now. Chrysler cars are being hacked, and they're saying that all of the other car manufacturers have similar types of risks to being able to be compromised. Whether it's your car or your refrigerator or your doorbell that is now IP-based, don't forget that that information is valuable, and you need to make sure that you protected it. I had a discussion with somebody the other day about refrigerators. I could care less if somebody steals my grocery list off of the refrigerator, is what they said. And my reply was, look, part of this is they keep track of the activity that's going on in that refrigerator too, sometimes for very valid reasons, to help improve the health improve the product itself, et cetera, et cetera. But if I open my refrigerator every morning at 6 o'clock in the morning before I go to work, and then when I get home at 9 o'clock at night or whatever the time may be, and I open my refrigerator to grab something out, ultimately I've established a pattern that's highly valuable to somebody that might want to physically rob my facility, or excuse me, my home. And the same thing goes for any IP, tracking IPs from a geo perspective, tracking where you drive to from, how long you're in the car, when you leave in the morning. All of those types of things are valuable. And so this problem is just going to get worse and worse and worse because these smart devices connecting to the IP, to the IP network, the internet more specifically, always want you to register them in your personal information in some way. And if all of that information can be correlated back, which it absolutely can, usually by your IP address or more importantly, your email address these days, all that's going to be extremely important. So don't think of just the problems today, but think of it in the future as well, and it's just getting worse and worse.
That's an interesting point. As a self-conscious individual, I just don't want people to know how many times I open the fridge in general. But it's a scary concept, and I think it's safe to say that Ocean's 22, our future heist movies are probably going to be very different with a lot of that taken into account. Jeff, any key takeaways or anything else that you'd like the listeners to take away from this?
I think Doug actually summed it up quite nicely. I would just add to it is at the bottom of these types of breaches, and I think when we had the origination of computers, we didn't think that we would be attached to 4 or 5 of them. We would be carrying around a computer in our pocket that has network access capabilities. I would challenge a lot of people on the phone is that they probably have more than 30 devices inside their house that are networked in some way, shape, or form. When you look at computers, tablets, phones, remote activity for lights, etc., it doesn't take much all of a sudden to get it to that level. And in the cases of iPads and tablets and computers and phones, we're also spreading our credentials across all of these. And so we have really password fatigue or user ID fatigue. And we have to solve that at the root of these to at least start to mitigate the ability to give away access. And the fact that 5 unique user ID passwords across hundreds of sites, that's the beginning, and they permeate your personal and professional lives. So to me, that's a beginning piece. The other side is the hygiene of security from end to end, and there is no silver bullet, but we have to start by adding the authenticity to the authentication and building a better way and a more convenient way for the users versus typically in security we just add layers on. So the door lock's not good enough, then add a monitoring system. If the monitoring system's not good enough, then you add a vault. If the vault's not good enough, then you take it to the bank and stick it inside the bank. So it becomes harder and harder. What we have to do is find the way to make it as simple as unlocking your door with the security of having it in a maximum safe somewhere.
Excellent. So when we kicked off this webinar, I asked our attendees that if they had any questions, they should go ahead and submit them to me through our chat functionality. And I hate to say it, we actually have not received any questions. So either we did a really great job of explaining everything, we put everyone to sleep, or I'm not understanding this chat functionality. But I think regardless, we can probably go ahead and move on. And I want to thank all of our attendees today. This actually concludes the meat of our webinar. Both Jeff and Doug have requested some time to talk a little bit about their respective companies, Automate and Savanture. So for our listeners that are interested in learning more about those 2 organizations, I encourage you guys to stay on the line. For everyone else, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us today. Jeff, Doug, the floor is yours.
Sure. So this is Doug. So Savanture is a managed security service provider. We deliver services in multiple different ways, but 2 primary ways are as a full MSSP, providing 24/7, including people, our security analysts and security experts, looking at your infrastructure and monitoring that by a 24/7 basis. And so the advantage there is purely twofold. Number one, because we have specialized tools and we have specialized individuals, We believe we can do that better than most organizations. Can't say that you can always do it better than any organization, but most organizations. And the second factor is obviously the fact that economically there's no way for an internal organization to do it at the same pricing levels and cost levels that a MSSP does. The second aspect of our service is replacing customer security infrastructure with our technology in a SaaS model where they still retain the analysis responsibility while we replace their SIEM, their log management, their scanning, and those types of elements within their infrastructure, all in the cloud, encrypted securely, obviously. And then ultimately, we deliver an analysis back to them on a ticketed basis that they take action on and do the incremental research and analysis to solve if it's an event that they need to take action on. So Jeff?
Thanks, Doug. So just a short view on Automate. So what we talked about today in this, and we talked about the breaches involved, exposed credentials, a key part, if not the epicenter of the breaches. And worse as we look at it, people are choosing convenience over security in many cases. Automate's focus is on credential orchestration across your company, allowing for better end-user security hygiene while keeping it simple and bridging the security gaps and eliminating the weak spots that exist in today's authentication solutions. So with Automate, you get security and convenience, and we eliminate what I'll call the weak spots or the holes and bridge those gaps in today's authentication solutions that aren't working. So if you're relating to this in your organization, you're listening to this today thinking, hey, I'd like to look at different ways of approaching this, we would love to hear from you. We can be reached on our website at www.automate.com or via sales@automate.com for email. I really appreciate everybody showing up today and listening to us. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Doug, for being on as well.
It was a pleasure having you both. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today, and I want to thank everybody in attendance who listened to us. I think this was very informational and entertaining as well.
Thanks, everybody.